You're watching the Everything Network.
What if John Gotti joined the mob in 1924? In real history, John Gotti belonged to a later age. He was a television-era gangster, a man built for flashbulbs, like courthouse steps, tailored suits, and the last loud years of the New York Mafia. But in this version, Gotti is born decades earlier, around the turn of the century, and by 1924 he is a young Brooklyn street operator walking into the mob while Prohibition is still feeding New York with money, violence, and ambition. The city is not yet ruled by the five families as the world would later know them. It is a rougher underworld, split between old Sicilian bosses, young Americanized gangsters, Jewish bootleggers, Irish dock crews, and neighborhood men who understand that liquor has turned every truck, cellar, pier, and backroom into a cash register. Gotti enters that world at the age when pride still feels stronger than caution. He is not the boss yet, he is not even close. In 1924, the men with real power are already sitting above him, men like Joe Masseria, men tied to older Sicilian networks, men who think in terms of tribute, silence, and survival. Gotti comes in as muscle and nerve, a young earner who knows how to make people look at him before he has earned the right to be seen. He dresses too clean for the corners he works. He talks too boldly for a man still taking orders. But the trucks he touches keep turning into money. And in Prohibition New York, money can forgive a lot. His first rise comes through hijacking. Liquor trucks moving from docks to warehouses become his school. He learns which drivers can be scared, which guards can be bought, which cops like envelopes, and which men need a beating before they remember who owns the street that week. The old bosses see a useful young animal, but the younger gangsters see something else. They see a man who understands reputation as a weapon. Gotti does not just want the score, he wants the corner to know who took it. That makes him dangerous in two directions. It scares rivals, but it also draws attention at a time when the old mob still prefers shadows over applause. By the middle of the decade, Gotti has become one of those Brooklyn names people say carefully. Not a boss, not a legend, a problem. He can bring in money, he can hold a crew together, and he has the personal loyalty of men who like that he stands close to danger instead of hiding behind orders. That kind of loyalty gives him power before he has a title. In another era, that would help create the Gotti myth. In 1924, it puts him under the eyes of men who do not like young gangsters becoming too loved by their own soldiers. Joe Masseria would have understood his value. Masseria's world needed hard young men who could take territory, move liquor, and answer insults fast. But Masseria would also have seen the defect. Gotti was not quiet enough. He had the kind of face people remembered, the kind of walk that turned a sidewalk into a stage. In a prohibition economy, that could win fear. In a mafia system still being built, it could also bring police, newspapers, and jealous captains. Gotti's biggest gift would become his biggest threat before he ever reached the top. The great test comes as New York's underworld begins moving toward the Castellammarese War. The younger men around Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia and others are already thinking beyond the old ways. They want a machine that runs on money, not old village pride. Gotti is caught between those worlds. His attitude fits the street side of Masseria's camp, but his hunger fits the younger Americanized gangsters. Luciano would not trust him fully, but he would study him. Lansky would see the risk in him. Costello would dislike the noise. Anastasia might respect the nerve. In this version, Gotti becomes a wartime captain before he becomes a made power. He is sent where softer men cannot hold ground. He pressures speakeasies, guards shipments, punishes defectors, and keeps Brooklyn crews from drifting toward rival bosses. His name spreads through bars, pool rooms, social clubs, and police files. Men start calling him Johnny Boy years before the newspapers ever learn what to do with him. He likes the name too much. That is the first sign that the future is turning against him. When Luciano and the younger faction finally move against the old order, Gotti has to choose. If he stays with Masseria, he becomes a loyal soldier to a dying style of power. If he moves with Luciano, he survives into the new mafia, but loses the fantasy that loyalty alone decides who wins. The smarter version of Gotti bends at the last minute. He does not betray loudly. He simply stops being where Masseria needs him most. It is the kind of quiet absence that saves his life and stains his name at the same time. After the war, the Commission is born and the American Mafia becomes more organized, more political, and more careful. That is where Gotti's alternate life changes sharply. In the real world, he rose in a mafia already built. In this world, he helps survive the building of it. But the Commission does not reward noise the way the street does. Men like Luciano and Costello want money protected from ego. They want bosses who can sit still, take meetings, and let other people be famous. Gotti can do the work, but he cannot disappear into it. By the early 1930s, John Gotti would be a feared Brooklyn captain, rich enough to dress like a boss, followed enough to act like one, but watched too closely to become one easily. The old-timers would call him dangerous. The younger bosses would call him useful. The newspapers would eventually find him. That is where his 1924 story becomes a warning. The Prohibition mob could make a man like Gotti faster than the later mafia ever did, but it could also destroy him earlier. In this timeline, John Gotti does not wait until the 1980s to become famous. He becomes famous when the mafia is still learning that fame can be a death sentence. Next part would carry him into the 1930s Commission era, where Luciano, Anastasia, Costello, and young Carlo Gambino decide whether Gotti is too valuable to kill or too loud to promote.
You're watching the Everything Network.
The Commission era. By 1931, the New York underworld had changed its language. The old boss system had not vanished completely, but the men who survived the war understood that the future belonged to structure. The Commission was not just a table of bosses. It was a warning to every ambitious street man that power now had rules above the sidewalk. John Gotti came out of the Castellamarese War with money, soldiers, and a name that carried weight in Brooklyn, but he also came a reputation for being too visible. The new bosses did not fear his fists first, they feared his appetite for attention. Lucky Luciano would not have looked at Gotti as a fool. Luciano understood street charisma. He knew that a crew followed a man for reasons that could not always be written into books or divided into tribute. Gotti had the kind of personal pull that could hold a neighbourhood through pressure, arrests, and rival offers. But Luciano also understood that charm could become a separate kingdom. A captain who turned himself into a public figure could stop sounding like a servant of the family and start sounding like a family of his own. Frank Costello saw the problem even more clearly. Costello's power came from doors that opened quietly. Judges, gamblers, politicians, union men, nightclub owners, and police officials did not want a mobster who brought reporters near the room. They wanted envelopes, signals, introductions, and silence. To Costello, Gotti was profitable but poorly shaped for the new order. He could collect, he could intimidate, he could keep men loyal, but he carried himself like the corner was already a courtroom and every passerby was a witness. He wanted to impress. Albert Anastasia had a different view. Anastasia respected nerve, and in this version he saw Gotti as one of the younger hard men who had survived the war without breaking. The two men would not be friends in the soft sense. Their bond would come from violence, work, and the shared belief that fear was still part of government. Anastasia could use a man like Gotti in Brooklyn. He could send him into a labour dispute, a dock problem, or a stubborn bookmaker's room and know the message would arrive complete. For a while, that protection kept Gotti alive. Carlo Gambino watched from a colder place. He was younger than the old bosses, but more patient than the loud men around him. In this timeline, Gambino saw Gotti early, long before Gotti could ever threaten a throne. He saw the suits, the confidence, the loyalty of the street soldiers, and the way Gotti enjoyed being the centre of a room. Gambino would not rush against him, he would mark him. In Gambino's mind, men like Gotti were not problems for the day they were useful. They were problems for the day they forgot who allowed them to be useful. Through the early 1930s, Gotti's crew became one of the sharper Brooklyn outfits tied to gambling houses, stolen liquor remnants, strong-arm collections, and the new rackets that survived after Prohibition began to die. When repeal came in 1933, the men who had lived on bootlegging needed new lanes. Some moved deeper into gambling, some pushed into unions, some leaned on construction, garment work, trucking, and waterfront theft. Gotti adapted faster than his enemies expected. He did not understand every political layer, but he understood one thing clearly. A man who controlled access to workers, trucks, and fear could still eat after the liquor money cooled. The end of Prohibition hurt lesser men more than it hurt Gotti. He had never been only a bottle man. He was a crew man, and crews could be moved from one hustle to another if the leader kept them fed. His Brooklyn people shifted into numbers, protection, dice games, card rooms, hijacked goods, and labor muscle. The money was not as glamorous as the roaring liquor years, but it was steadier. Gotti began to learn the quiet lesson of the new mafia against his own nature. A boss did not need every score to shine. A boss needed every score to pay. Still, the old weakness stayed with him. Gotti wanted his men to know he was winning. He wanted rival crews to see the car, the coat, the restaurant table, the ring, the smile. In neighborhoods where poverty made even a good suit look like a declaration of war, Gotti turned success into theater. Younger men loved him for it. Older men hated him for the same reason. Every time he walked into a club and the room adjusted around him, another boss somewhere heard about it. By the middle of the decade, the federal government was changing too. The underworld had spent years thinking local police could be managed, judges could be reached, and witnesses could be frightened. But the new federal pressure on organized crime began to create a different kind of danger. A loud gangster could no longer count on neighborhood silence forever. Files traveled, names traveled, photographs traveled. Gotti's image, once a street weapon, started becoming a government tool. Luciano's 1936 prosecution shook the entire system. In this alternate timeline, Gotti watched one of the architects of the new order fall not from a street ambush, but from courtrooms, testimony, public heat, and the state's desire to make an example. The lesson should have been simple. A man who became too visible could be trapped by enemies he could not shoot. Gotti understood the lesson in his head. He rejected it in his blood. He believed Luciano had been unlucky, badly exposed, or betrayed by weaker people. He did not believe the same machine could one day be pointed at him. After Luciano went down, the balance around New York tightened. Costello rose in influence. Anastasia remained feared. Luciano still had reach from prison, but the street had to adjust to a world where even the cleverest boss could be taken away. Gotti's captains and soldiers expected him to step forward. They had followed him through bootlegging, war years, repeal, and the first federal storms. They wanted more. They wanted a seat that matched the name. Gotti wanted it too, but the commission had not forgotten what kind of man he was. The question in the late 1930s was not whether Gotti was powerful. He was. The question was whether he could be trusted with power that required silence. Anastasia argued for him in certain rooms, not out of affection, but out of use. Costello argued against him in quieter ways, pointing to the heat, the clothes, the crowds, and the police interest. Gambino said little and remembered everything. The commission's answer was compromise. Gotti could keep Brooklyn's strength, expand earnings, and sit closer to the serious men, but he would not be allowed to become a full boss while older, quieter powers still breathed. That decision changed him. It did not humble him. It sharpened the grievance that would define the next stage of his life. In public, Gotti played loyal captain. He smiled, paid tribute, attended wakes, sent gifts, and made the right greetings at weddings and social clubs. In private, he began to speak about men who hid behind politics, men who ate from the street but did not stand on it, men who called themselves bosses while other people carried the danger. His crew heard those words and understood them as prophecy. The commission heard echoes of them and understood them as a countdown. By 1939, with war clouds gathering over Europe and America still pretending distance would protect it, John Gotti had become one of New York's most dangerous, half-promoted men. He was too rich to ignore, too loved by his soldiers to insult openly, too useful to throw away, and too loud to trust completely. In another timeline, the world would meet him in the late 20th century as the Dapper Don. In this one, the name begins earlier, whispered first with admiration, then with irritation, then with fear. The young Brooklyn hijacker of 1924 had survived into the Commission Age, but survival had not cured him. It had convinced him that the city owed him more.
You're watching the Everything Network.
By 1940, John Gotti was no longer the young hijacker from the old liquor days. He had survived Prohibition, survived the Castellammarise War, survived the birth of the Commission, and survived the disappointment of being held below the throne. That kind of survival changed a man. It did not make him quieter. It made him more certain that the room had underestimated him. In Brooklyn, his name carried weight with gamblers, truckers, dock thieves, lone men, and young soldiers who wanted a boss they could see with their own eyes. The problem was simple. Gotti had become too large for a captain and too dangerous for a boss. The Commission liked men who could earn, obey, and stay in position. Gotti could earn. He could obey when obedience served him. But staying in position felt like an insult. Every wedding, funeral, card game and restaurant table became another place where people watched him act like a man waiting for a crown. When the Second World War pulled America into a larger storm, the New York mob found new ways to make money and new ways to prove usefulness. The waterfront became even more valuable. Ships, cargo, labor, military supplies, black market goods and union pressure all moved through places where the underworld already had hands. Gotti's Brooklyn crew adapted quickly. They knew which docks were loose, which foremen were scared, which truck routes could be bent, and which stolen goods could disappear into warehouses before morning. In this period, Albert Anastasia became Gotti's shield. Anastasia did not trust him completely, but he understood his value. Gotti could keep men disciplined through fear and admiration at the same time. He could walk into a labour problem and make the room choose peace before the first chair moved. He could take a crew that wanted to freelance and bring it back under tribute. For Anastasia, that made him useful. For Costello, that made him dangerous. For Gambino, that made him predictable in the worst way. Gotti's crew grew during the war years. Young men came home from the service with hard eyes and no patience for factory wages. Others never left the city, but learned that wartime shortages created profit in meat, gasoline, tyres, clothing, medicine, and stolen freight. Gotti gave them a flag to stand under. He did not speak like a banker or a politician. He spoke like a neighbourhood king who believed loyalty should be paid in cash, protection, and respect at the table. But the same qualities that made soldiers love him made the bosses nervous. Gotti rewarded loyalty loudly. He punished disrespect quickly. He showed up in tailored clothes when other men preferred dark corners and quiet exits. Reporters began hearing his name in connection with gambling houses, dock trouble, union disputes, and Brooklyn social clubs. His public file thickened. The police did not always have a case, but they had a face, a style, and a trail of men who seemed to stand straighter when he entered a room. By 1945, with the war ending and the city adjusting again, the mob faced another transition. The wartime black market lanes began cooling. Gambling remained strong, labour rackets remained strong. Construction, trucking, garment work and waterfront control became more important. Gotti understood muscle and tribute, but the post-war mafia was becoming more financial, more political and more national. Las Vegas was rising, Havana was glowing, unions and legitimate businesses became cleaner coats for dirty money. Frank Costello thrived in that world. He was comfortable with judges, mayors, fixers, businessmen, casino men and quiet political arrangements. Gotti hated that kind of power even when he benefited from it. He saw Costello as a man who ate from fear but did not like to stand near it. Costello saw Gotti as a street performer with too many loyal men and too little discipline. Their conflict did not begin with gunfire. It began with tone, distance, and every small insult that men in that world knew how to hear. Gotti began building what later investigators would call a shadow family inside his own family. He had captains loyal to the official structure, but beneath them were young men loyal to him personally. He helped with lawyer money, he helped widows, he sent envelopes to families when men went away. He remembered who stood firm and who spoke too much. In the old world, that was how a leader built a following. In the commission world, that was how a captain began to look like a future rebellion. Carlo Gambino watched all of it. He did not move against Gotti yet. He understood that a loud man could clear a path for a quiet one. As long as Gotti drew attention, other men could build deeper. As long as Gotti fought over pride, other men could collect permanent interests. Gambino's patience made him more dangerous than Gotti understood. Gotti measured power by loyalty in the room. Gambino measured power by who still had options after the room emptied. By the late 1940s, Gotti had become a Brooklyn institution. Men came to him to settle disputes. Club owners paid him to avoid trouble. Truckers feared him, gamblers respected him, and younger soldiers treated his approval like a promotion. Yet he still did not hold the official seat he believed belonged to him. That was the wound under everything. He had money, but not final authority. He had followers, but not the commission's blessing. He had fame in the street, but fame was still not the same as permission. The next crisis came through Anastasia. As long as Anastasia remained powerful, Gotti had protection from men who wanted him reduced. But Anastasia's own reputation brought heat, enemies, and old grudges. He was feared, but fear alone could not freeze politics forever. Costello's circle, Gambino's patience, and the changing national picture all created pressure around Anastasia's world. Gotti did not see the full board. He saw a shield, and he believed that shield would stand as long as men were afraid to touch it. When Anastasia's position began weakening, Gotti's enemies understood the moment. They did not need to attack him first. They needed to remove the protection above him, isolate his loyalists, and force him to choose between obedience and open defiance. Gotti had spent decades building the image of a man who never bent. Now the system was preparing to test whether the image could survive actual pressure. By the early 1950s, John Gotti was rich, feared, and boxed in. He had outlived the bootleggers, outgrown the street corners, and survived every underworld shift since 1924. But the American mafia had become less forgiving with every passing year. The bosses no longer needed every loud man who could hold a block. They needed men who could protect gambling empires, union money, casino interests, and political connections from federal attention. Gotti was still useful, but he was no longer necessary in the same way. That was when useful became dangerous. The 1950s were supposed to be the age of controlled power. The American mafia had money in gambling, labor, construction, trucking, garment districts, waterfront rackets, jukeboxes, nightclubs, loans, and casinos. The older chaos of Prohibition had become a corporate underworld, still violent underneath, but dressed in sharper language. Men spoke about territories, agreements, tribute, votes, and commissions. The mob had learned how to sit behind legitimate fronts while the street did the frightening for them. John Gotti never fully belonged to that transformation. He adapted enough to survive, but not enough to disappear. He had investments, bookmakers, union pressure, and men who could turn a threat into a payment plan. But when he entered a room, people still saw the old street captain, the Prohibition survivor, the Brooklyn man with the bright suit and the hard smile. He represented an earlier force the mafia still needed but no longer wanted as its face. The rise of Carlo Gambino changed the temperature around him. Gambino did not waste words on public insults. His silence carried more danger than another man's threats. By the time Gambino became one of the strongest figures in New York, Gotti understood that the old ceiling above him had become iron. Costello had never wanted him high. Gambino wanted him useful but contained. Other bosses respected his money and feared his following. but none of them wanted the commission table turned into a Brooklyn stage. Gotti's men took this personally. They had grown older under him. Some had followed him since the liquor days. Some were sons and nephews of men who had worked his trucks, guarded his clubs, or done prison time without speaking. They saw their boss passed over again and again while quieter men moved into cleaner chairs. To them, Gotti was the one who had stood in front when danger came. To the commission, that was exactly why he could not be allowed to rise. The tension sharpened after the national hearings and public investigations of organised crime. Cameras, subpoenas, police files and newspaper attention were becoming stronger weapons. The mob could no longer pretend fame was harmless. Every famous gangster became a doorway for prosecutors. Every photographed dinner became a map. Every loud captain created a path from the sidewalk to the boss above him. Gotti had been warned for years, but warnings had never felt like orders to him. In this alternate timeline, the bosses give him one final arrangement. Gotti can remain a powerful Brooklyn captain with expanded control over selected rackets, but he must reduce his public life, stop gathering young soldiers as personal loyalists, and accept that he will never become boss while the current order stands. The message is delivered politely. That makes it worse. In Gotti's mind, respect given through limits is not respect. It is a cage with a better carpet. He tries to obey for a while. The suits become darker, the club appearances become fewer, the public greetings become shorter. His men are told to lower the temperature, but nobody believes the change is real. Gotti's silence has no natural rhythm. It feels performed, and everyone around him can hear the anger beneath it. In back rooms, he starts speaking again about old men, soft hands and bosses who forgot what the street cost. That is when Gambino begins cutting around him. Not with a direct strike, not at first. A bookmaker here is moved under another captain. A union contact there is told to report through a different channel. A young soldier close to Gotti is offered promotion away from him. A loan operation is reviewed, a gambling house is questioned. None of it looks like war by itself. But together, it draws a line around Gotti's power and begins shrinking the space inside it. Gotti recognizes the move too late. He is used to enemies who show their teeth. Gambino does not. Gambino turns the organization itself into the weapon. He makes obedience look like administration. He makes isolation look like policy. He makes every complaint from Gotti sound like pride instead of politics. The more Gotti pushes back, the easier it becomes for the bosses to say the same thing they have said for 30 years. John is valuable, but John cannot be trusted. By the time Anastasia is removed from power in the late 50s, Gotti's world cracks. The shield is gone. The men who once feared offending Anastasia now feel free to discuss Gotti as an old problem. He is not young anymore, but he is not harmless. Older gangsters with pride and soldiers can be more dangerous than ambitious boys. They know where money is buried. They know who lied. They know which peace agreements were built on fear instead of love. Gotti has two choices. He can accept a rich exile inside the family, keep earning, keep dressing well, and die as the captain who almost became more. Or he can make a move against the system that has denied him for decades. The younger men around him want the second path. They tell him the street is still with him. They tell him Brooklyn will stand. They tell him the bosses have gone soft. They say all the words a proud man wants to hear when he is already angry enough to believe them. But Gotti is older now, and age has given him one thing he did not have in 1924. He understands timing, not patience, not fully. Timing. He knows a reckless strike against Gambino would not become a revolution. It would become a funeral schedule. So he does something more dangerous. He starts building a legend while still alive. He lets the younger men believe he is the last real street boss. He lets every denied promotion become proof of jealousy. He lets every commission limit become proof that the old guard fears him. That legend spreads faster than his actual power. In Brooklyn bars, men begin speaking of Gotti as the boss who should have been. In social clubs, younger soldiers compare him to the quieter men above him and choose the man they can see. In police files, he becomes more than a captain. He becomes a symbol of a possible split inside the New York mob. The Commission understands the danger. A man does not need a title to divide loyalty. Sometimes the title people think he deserves is enough. By 1960, John Gotti has become the ghost of an alternate mafia future. He is what the organisation might have looked like if the loud Prohibition captains had beaten the political men. He is rich, ageing, proud, and surrounded by younger soldiers who treat his disappointments as holy history. He never becomes the clean commission boss Luciano's system would accept. He becomes something less official and more unstable, like a living argument against the men who built the modern mafia. And that is where the what-if turns darker. In the real timeline, Gotti rose late and burned bright under television lights. In this timeline, he rises early, gets blocked for decades, and becomes famous before fame has a camera worthy of him. He does not destroy the mafia from the top. He weakens it from the side by proving that street charisma can survive every order meant to bury it. By the time the bosses finally decide whether to retire him, exile him, or remove him, the name John Gotti already belongs to more than one man. It belongs to every young soldier who believes the Commission stole a crown from Brooklyn. Next would be the split. Gotti's Brooklyn loyalists versus Gambino's quieter machine, with the Commission deciding whether he gets a retirement package or a death sentence.